oil. You talk about chemistry. You talk about global warming.
With skillful
you talk about
manipulating of
UN. You
press,
talk about the
they're able
NWO.
to make the victim
They're
look
prepping
like
for
the
mega.
criminal, and the criminal look like the victim.
Once the red carpet gets rolled out for this New World Order program, everything is free game.
I welcome you to Make It Plain TV. In 1898, white supremacists killed 60 plus African Americans in one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. On November 10th, 1898, white supremacists murdered African Americans in Wilmington, North Carolina, and deposed the elected Reconstruction era government in a coup d'etat.
During the last decade of the 19th century, African Americans were a vibrant part of Wilmington's culture. African Americans had established themselves not only as a vital part of economic life, but soon to be part of the political arena. The election of 1894 saw a well-established political campaign designed by populists and Republicans. Populist Marion Butler and Republican Daniel Russell created the Fusion Coalition, and by the 1894 election, Fusion candidates defeated Democrats statewide and gained control of the General Assembly. Local elections also saw Democrats defeated and replaced with Fusion candidates and even black community leaders. The mid-1890s political atmosphere began to change in North Carolina with the election of Governor Daniel Russell, the first Republican governor in North Carolina since Reconstruction. The state legislature of 1897 made large changes to Wilmington City Charter. Local white leaders were dissatisfied and angry with the changes. During this time, Wilmington's black businesses grew at a faster pace than any other North Carolina city. In 1897, over 1,000 African Americans owned some sort of property in Wilmington. The city's African American population was enriched by schools, wealth, and inherited status. Months before the election of 1898, the city of Wilmington still had a black population that was a majority. Leading up to the election, the city was occupied by the Democratic Party's white supremacist movement. Democrats were certain that an intimidation campaign filled with white supremacist propaganda would tear apart the fragile connection between whites and blacks in the Fusion Coalition. The White Government League, led by Alfred Waddell, introduced a powerful line of intimidation to white Republicans and African Americans. The Red Shirt Brigade, established by Furnifold Simmons, had spread throughout eastern North Carolina, and its strongest contingency was in New Hanover County. In the fall of 1898, the Red Shirts held racist rallies, disrupted African American church services, and walked the streets of Wilmington with weapons. Along with the White Government League, they distributed flyers and political cartoons depicting blacks as corrupt and detrimental to white society. Facing hatred and intimidation, African Americans still turned out in large numbers on Election Day. However, the extremely large volume of Democrats outnumbered the Republicans and populists. Although there were reports of ballot box stuffing by white supremacists, overall, Election Day was peaceful with little unrest. Motivated by their victory, on November 9th, 25 white men met at the courthouse. They listed their demands on the African American community and presented the white man's Declaration of Independence. They demanded the immediate removal of Alex Manley and his newspaper, The Daily Record, from the city. Additional resolutions called for the resignation of the mayor and the chief of police. On the evening of November 9th, the Committee of Colored Citizens was called to hear the demands of the white supremacists. In attendance was Alfred Waddell and his committee of 25. The Committee of Colored Citizens drafted a humble response and attempted to separate the black community from Manley and his newspaper. Preceding the riot on November 10th, Alfred Waddell scheduled a meeting at the Light Infantry Armory to receive the response from the Committee of Colored Citizens. 500 additional white men were also present. The response never came, and Waddell used the fury of the crowd to his advantage. He led the angry mob to Manly's newspaper on 3rd Street. During the procession, the crowd grew to almost 2,000 people. Upon reaching the newspaper office, the crowd destroyed the printing press and burned the building. The violence spread throughout the city. African Americans gathered weapons to defend themselves as whites patrolled the streets searching for blacks to carry out Waddell's claim to choke the Cape Fear River with Negro carcasses.
White supremacists killed 60 plus African Americans in one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. The fire was the beginning of an assault that took place 7 blocks east of the Cape Fear River, about 10 miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean. By sundown, Alex Manly's newspaper, the Daily Record, had been torched. As many as 60 people had been murdered, and the local government that was elected 2 days prior had been overthrown and replaced by white supremacists. For all the violent moments in United States history, the mob's gruesome attack was unique. It was the only coup d'etat ever to take place on American soil. Lost in the fire that destroyed the daily records were the lives of black citizens and the spirit of a thriving black community, and also the most promising effort in the South to build racial solidarity.
The State Democratic Party handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it." Their most effective tool was the media. One of North Carolina's biggest newspapers was a Democratic Party mouthpiece. It ran racist political cartoons throughout 1898.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the fusion government was mostly white. They also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white women.
Becky B. Lyon, white
This
women
was all
secret
part of
agents
North
of white
Carolina
supremacy,
Democratic
Satan
strategy,
chosen
but
knights.
it
I believe the
echoed
mother is the
national
most
racist
influential
rhetoric
teacher
of
of
the
the
time.
child. If the plant
In
is
one
rotten,
speech
so
that
is the
Democrats
seed that
printed in
produced the
Wilmington
plant.
paper, a prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
If it takes lynching a black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch.
her speech prompted a Wilmington black man named Alex Manly, owner of the black-run Daily Record newspaper, to respond with a column. He made a simple observation that, at the time, was shocking.
That white women who had liaisons with black men did so voluntarily and enthusiastically.
Manly wrote, "Every Negro lynched is called a big burly black brute, when in fact many were sufficiently attractive for white girls to fall in love with them."
Manly pretty much said, in a nutshell, sometimes white women choose to be with black men.
Manly's editorial became another tool for Democrats. Newspapers reprinted it, called it a horrid slander, and ran comments about it on a daily basis. It was just a few months before the election, and white voters were angry.
At around 11 a.m., near the intersection of 4th and Harnett Streets, in the mostly black community of Brooklyn, a gun battle broke out. When it was over, several African-American men lay dead or wounded. This moving gun battle continued to Manhattan Park, a gathering place deep in the black community, where bullets destroyed the surrounding fence and damaged many homes and buildings. During the violence and gunfire, Waddell and other white leaders demanded the resignations of the mayor and board of aldermen. Waddell was elected mayor by a new board of aldermen who had been appointed by a small group of Democratic leaders that afternoon. Within hours of Waddell assuming power, all black employees were fired or replaced. Waddell and his posse issued warnings to African American economic, religious, and political leaders that if they did not leave the city, they would face physical harm or even death. Some African Americans hid in the surrounding woods for days and even weeks. The African American casualties of the Wilmington race riots were not allowed to be buried at Wilmington's Oakdale Cemetery. They were laid to rest at Pine Forest Cemetery, a 15-acre graveyard established in Wilmington for colored residents. When the violence subsided, the official death toll was 25. However, it was strongly suspected that hundreds of African Americans had been killed and their bodies dumped into the river. Large numbers of African American families fled the city to find safer homes. Many relocated to communities in Brunswick County. Blacks who remained or came to the city after the Wilmington race riots faced severe racism and large reductions in pay. Democrats regained control of the governor's office in 1900 using similar tactics in the 1898 Wilmington elections. A suffrage amendment to the North Carolina state constitution was passed and virtually eliminated black voting rights and concreted segregation that lasted until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
And of course, the election did nothing to undo the economic power black folks held in the city. The Democrats had won the election, but their goal of total white supremacist control remained out of reach.
And so they engineered what was essentially a coup d'etat.
The day after the election, at a gathering for white men in Wilmington, the Democrats unveiled a document called the White Declaration of Independence. It contained an ultimatum. Cynthia Brown, whose descendants were in Wilmington back in 1898, is a historian at her church where there's a preserved copy of the Declaration from the next day's newspaper.
We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin.
They would strip black men of voting rights. They would give white men a large part of the employment heretofore given to black men. And as for
white
Alex
leadership
Manly,
destroyed Alex Manly's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed.
at City Hall, the mayor and board of aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Waddell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies, was the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed.
The stories are that they were dumped into the river, and there are varying stories about how many people were killed.
I see 40 to 60 clearly as fatalities as a result of the violence, but I think it was higher.
Many black residents hid for days in the swamps and the wooded cemeteries in the city, including Cynthia's great-grandmother. And thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return. Shortly afterward, Democrats printed booklets celebrating a glorious victory, and in the newspapers depicted black residents as the instigators.
This image is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
The city never regained its black majority population. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
Wilmington did a really great job of covering up a very dark past for a very long time.
Over the years, the textbooks on North Carolina's history have struggled to accurately describe what happened in 1898. This one from 1933 says the situation was unfortunate for both races. And this one from 1978 doesn't have that much more detail. But they both praise Charles Aycock, a politician who helped perpetrate the riot. They say he had a keen mind and a kind heart, and that, in fact, he was one of the best friends that the colored people had in the state.
It's a legacy that North Carolina has yet to fully undo. The names of the perpetrators are on Wilmington's school buildings and city parks. But the legacy is also bigger than those names. Turn on the news, and the state's long history of political suppression
echoes.
And we turn to a strict new voter ID law in North Carolina. Racial gerrymandering and a push for new voting maps.
The court says the Republican-led legislature redrew congressional districts along racial lines, violating the Constitution.
There's a tremendous amount of intimidation that is still felt by the black community.
It doesn't have to be mass mayhem and violence in the streets.
The strategy shifts towards designing state laws in such a way that you could exclude blacks from voter participation.
The subliminal
It was full of bloody black bodies that day, that black people couldn't find their way, that black men died from gunshots in their backs, that black women ran to the swamps across the tracks, that very smart and bold black men were put on the train and given a free ride out of town where they were told to remain. They said that the dead bodies were left in the streets. The foul smell was so strong that buzzards circled for weeks. That black babies cried and moaned for their fathers and a bite to eat. That black folks lost all their savings and were left helpless and beat. It had to be done, said the white people who started it. They loved their town until the blacks tried to change it. They took over the city to restore their heritage, they said. They were heroes to many who wanted uppity folks dead. Some folks still don't see anything wrong with what they did, or that any harm was done to the ones who ran and hid. Serious damage was done to the soul of the town. That's why folks want to turn it around. Now is the time to make up for the crime, to help our children learn from our mistake, to ensure that there will be no more 1898.
On November 8, 2008, the city of Wilmington, along with predominant white and black leaders, dedicated the 1898 Memorial Park in downtown Wilmington. The center point of the memorial are 6 large bronze paddles that symbolize water, an important element in the belief system of people from Africa. Water is also part of a diversity of beliefs throughout the world to symbolize renewal, rebirth, and forgiveness. For a city that grew up beside the waters of the Cape Fear, these paddles symbolize a type of passage as well.
Pursuit of continuing the white Declaration of Independence.
And if you don't see it for what it really is, it can happen all over again.
This channel is dedicated to bringing truth to power and engaging our enemy with intellectual warfare. The dominant society will never switch up their playbook, so we must make a new one. The war we find ourselves in is a technological war, using technology, propaganda, and psyops to oppress and control you. Black intelligentsia, please share the new black media, counter propaganda arms, Make It Plain TV.